The morning air over northern Germany was still and heavy, thick with the smell of oil, metal, and surrender. The war was over, at least on paper, but for the men of the U.S. 9th Air Force, victory meant something different now. It meant inventory. It meant walking through ruins and wreckage, tagging whatever the Nazis had left behind. Inside a hangar at Gotha Wagon Fabric, an engineer named Lieutenant Robert Hamilton kicked open a rusted door and stepped into the dimness. Dust floated in golden shafts of light, slicing through bullet holes in the roof. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then his flashlight caught a strange shape under a torn canvas. "Get that tarp off," he said. The soldiers hesitated. They'd seen dozens of wrecked planes before, Messerschmitts with their shark noses, the blunt Focke-Wulfs. But this looked different. The men grabbed the edges of the tarp and pulled. Underneath, something black and smooth emerged from the dust. It wasn't a normal fuselage. There was no tail, no vertical stabilizer. Just an enormous wing, stretching like a stingray frozen mid-swim. Its skin gleamed faintly, not like aluminum, but almost like stone polished by wind. Hamilton stepped closer. He placed a gloved hand on the surface. It felt wrong. Too smooth, too warm. "This thing," he muttered, "shouldn't fly." Another engineer crouched, brushing away soot to reveal a small, painted marking near the edge. HO-9V3. The letters looked hand-stenciled, the paint faded but deliberate. "What the hell is a HO-9?" someone asked. No one answered. Instead, they circled the machine like men at a crime scene. One soldier ran his fingers along the seam where would met metal, and when he lifted them, his glove was smeared with black residue. "Feels like cold dust," he said. Hamilton frowned. "Or something that eats radar." It was a joke, half serious, half nervous. In 1945, radar still felt like science fiction. But when one of the engineers shone his light across the leading edge, he noticed the layers, plywood bonded with a tarry, carbon-like compound. A crude composite. Primitive, but purposeful. The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. The engines, two Jumo 004 jet turbines, were mounted inside the wing itself. The cockpit sat flush with the surface, barely a bump. There was no tail, no external frame, just a flying wing. A single, sweeping shape designed to slice through the air without resistance. "This isn't German," Hamilton said quietly. "This is something else." He wasn't wrong. The plans found in the corner confirmed the names, Raymar and Walter Horton. Two brothers. Experimental designers from Bonn. According to the notes, this was Project 229, their attempt to build a jet fighter that could outrun, outclimb, and outsmart anything in the sky. But what truly caught Hamilton's attention wasn't the design, it was the date. The logbook showed test flights scheduled for early 1945, weeks before the Reich collapsed. Somehow, in the chaos of defeat, someone had kept this hidden. One of the engineers whistled low. "Looks like something from the future." Hamilton didn't reply. He was staring at the curve of the wing where light disappeared into matte darkness. No reflection, no shine. It was as if the plane swallowed the light whole. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the distant rumble of trucks and voices, more units arriving to strip the factory. In a few hours, this relic would be crated up, shipped to America, and filed away among the hundreds of strange trophies pulled from Hitler's collapsing empire. But standing there, in that moment, Hamilton felt something else, a chill that didn't come from the cold. He walked around the machine one last time, running his hand over the insignia barely visible beneath the dust, a faded black cross, painted on a surface meant not to be seen. He looked back at his men. "Tag it for transport," he said. "Top priority." "Sir," one of them asked, "what do we call it?" Hamilton paused. "Call it whatever you want. Just make sure it gets home." That night, as they loaded the black-winged craft onto a truck bound for the Allied Research Depot, Hamilton wrote a short note in his field report. Unidentified aircraft discovered at Gotha plant. Construction anomalous. Possibly experimental jet. Recommending technical review, urgently. He didn't know that decades later, engineers at Northrop and later at Lockheed Martin would study those same curves, those same materials. That the very shape before him, born in a losing war, would become the ghostly silhouette of a new kind of warfare. But in that May of 1945, it was just another piece of the enemy's imagination, another secret dragged from the rubble. As the truck rumbled into the night, its headlights caught the wing's edge one last time, a flash of dark silver that vanished as quickly as it appeared. No one spoke. They didn't yet realize they had uncovered the first stealth aircraft in history. The plane that wasn't supposed to exist. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Before it became a secret under tarps and dust, it began as a dream between two brothers on a windy hill near Bonn. Reimar was 15, Walter 17, both obsessed with wings. Their father, a stern former officer of the Great War, believed in discipline, but the boys believed in air. They scavenged wood from barns, wire from bicycles, cloth from their mother's curtains. On weekends, they dragged their homemade gliders up grassy slopes and threw themselves into the wind. No engines, no instruments, just air, instinct, and gravity waiting below. Reimar, the younger one, sketched constantly: birds, clouds, curves of air. The perfect wing, he wrote in a school notebook, is one with no drag and no fear. Walter, steadier and stronger, built what his brother imagined. They called their first glider the Hoei. It flew 20 seconds before shattering on landing. They rebuilt it the next day. By 1933, Germany had changed. Swastikas replaced flags, and the new government poured money into anything that could fly. The glider clubs became training grounds for a future Luftwaffe. The Horten brothers, now in their early 20s, suddenly found sponsors instead of skeptics. The Ho 3, their sleek, tailless glider, took first place in the National Luftwaffe competition in 1938. Reimar remembered it vividly: the silence before takeoff, the way the judges leaned forward as the glider rose without sound, slicing through the air like a knife made of sky. That victory brought them a visitor they hadn't expected: Hermann Göring himself. The Reichsmarshal walked through their workshop in uniform, so heavy with metals it clinked when he moved. He stared at the unfinished frame of their next design and said, half amused, half impressed, "You want to fly without a tail? Then prove it works. Give these dreamers engines, and see what happens." It wasn't a request. It was an order. The brothers suddenly had everything they'd ever wanted: funding, materials, a factory team. But it came with a contract written in the language of war. Göring's staff demanded a fighter capable of crossing the Channel, reaching London, and returning without refueling. Speed above 1,000 kilometers an hour. Payload enough for 2 cannons. And most importantly, minimal radar visibility. Not because they understood stealth, but because they wanted a ghost. Walter, the elder, joined the Luftwaffe as a test pilot to protect their project from bureaucrats. Reimar stayed behind, drawing blueprints by candlelight, shaping models with his bare hands. He hated the politics, but loved the challenge. In one of his letters to Walter, he wrote, "If I can make the air forget the plane exists, it will be the purest flight ever built." Their workshop became part laboratory, part cathedral. The walls smelled of glue, resin, and engine oil. Workers joked that Reimar spoke to his wings like a priest to his altar. He would run his palms along the edges, eyes half closed, whispering calculations instead of prayers. But the Reich was running out of time. The Allies bombed factories daily. Aluminum was scarce. So Reimar turned to wood, dense, flexible, alive. He coated it in a dark resin mixed with powdered coal, claiming it would absorb both light and waves. The engineers laughed at him. "It's a myth," they said. "Radar can't be fooled." He just smiled. "We'll see." The prototype they built, the Ho 9V1, was unarmed and unpainted, but when it glided off the runway at Göttingen in early 1944, even the skeptical officers fell silent. It didn't climb like a plane, it floated like a thought. When it landed, Göring's inspectors were waiting. They congratulated the brothers, then demanded a version with twin-jet engines. The dream was about to become a weapon. Walter flew the next test flight himself. The jet roared down the strip, tail flames licking the air. For a few seconds, it seemed unstoppable. Then a turbine seized, flames erupted, and the machine tumbled into the trees. Walter crawled out, shaken but alive. The wreck smoldered behind him like a warning. They rebuilt again, faster this time, naming it Ho 229. It was half experiment, half prophecy, a flying wing with no right to exist. Reimar watched from the edge of the runway, wind tugging at his coat, thinking not of glory, but of survival. He He knew what they were creating had nothing to do with Hitler's fantasies. This was evolution under fire, nature reinvented by desperation. In a diary found after the war, one line stood out, written in his thin, precise handwriting. The future will not have propellers. The air will be quiet. Machines will be invisible. He was right, but he wouldn't live to see that future. Not yet, because the next chapter of their creation, the final test, would decide whether the dream of two glider boys could truly fly beyond the war that built it, and whether anyone would ever know their names. In 1944, the Allies owned the daylight. American bombers drew contrails over the Reich like chalk lines on a blackboard, and by evening, the countryside glittered with broken glass. If the Luftwaffe still flew, it flew on fumes and courage. But in a forest compound near Gotha, where trees muffled the sound of hammers and men spoke in the hush of conspirators, two brothers kept building a shape the sky had never seen. Snow lay in thin seams along the runways at Ohrdruf. The air smelled of cold iron and burned kerosene. Inside a drafty shed, the wing waited, black, smooth, more creature than machine. Workers in wool coats ran palms along its edges to warm the resin. It wasn't aluminum. There wasn't enough metal left for dreams. It was wood, layered tight, its grain swallowed under a varnish darkened with powdered coal. The mixture left smudges on the fingertips, a stain that didn't wash off for days. "We didn't call it stealth," Raymar Horton would say in a later interview. "We called it survival." The plan was simple on paper. A flying wing with two Jumo 004 turbojets buried in its body, a cockpit set like a blister on a manta ray, and no tail to catch the air or the enemy's eyes. To the older engineers, it was blasphemy. To the younger ones, it felt like cheating time. They rolled the prototype, Ho-229V2, onto the snow-dusted strip in late winter. The mechanics buttoned panels with numb hands. Walter Horton, leather cap pulled low, ran a gloved finger over the leading edge, nodded once, and climbed the ladder into the cockpit. A crew chief leaned close and shouted over the wind, "Engines will run hot." Walter smiled without humor. "Everything runs hot." The turbines spooled with a rising metallic whine. Snow lifted in spirals. For a moment the machine trembled, as if remembering gravity. Then it slid forward, faster, faster, and tore itself free of the runway. Up there, it didn't roar. It hissed. It sliced the air with a confidence that made the men below feel both proud and afraid. A ground observer later wrote, "It passed like a shadow with heat." The wing banked once, twice, answering the slightest pressure on the stick with animal grace. Walter kept it low, tracing the line of trees, then eased into a climb that made the sky seem closer than it had any right to be. On the field, Raymar stood with a stopwatch and a prayer he would never say out loud. The wind cut through his coat. He watched the arc, the glide, the way the wing refused to show a profile to the world. 15 minutes. 20. He exhaled only when the wheels kissed the runway in a long, skidding embrace. The mechanics broke into unpracticed cheers. Someone shouted, "It flies." Someone else, quieter, "It will change everything." The second flight came too soon. Pressure from above did not care for caution. Memos spoke in numbers, not margins. Weather colder, fuel thinner, the Jumo turbines angrier. Walter climbed again, the wings steady, the instruments twitching. At 700 meters, a cough. At 800, a flame. The right engine surged red. For an instant, the aircraft was half bird, half torch. Witnesses saw the wing yaw left, Walter kick hard to correct, the fire licking backward along the skin like a tongue. The nose dipped. Trees rushed up as if to help. The impact was not loud, snow swallows sound. When the smoke cleared, the wing lay in 3 broken ideas. Walter crawled from the wreckage with a cut across his forehead and a stare that made even officers look away. Raymar walked into the trees and didn't speak for a long time. The project paused. Not canceled. Nothing was canceled that winter. Only postponed and renamed, but frozen in the bureaucracy that had once fed it. Reports were written in the thin language of failure. Engine flameout. Pilot recovered. Structural integrity acceptable. But buried in a test summary was a line that did not fit the rest. Radar returned signature markedly low, less than 1/10 that of Me 262 under comparable conditions. No one signed that sentence. It had no author, only implications. They rebuilt a third prototype, V3, slower, under bombardment, in workshops where daylight slid through gaps in roof tiles and men hammered with one ear for sirens. The wood came from wherever wood still existed. The resin stank stronger, the cold dust ground finer. Raymar changed the way the layers met, insisting the wing should swallow waves the way it swallowed wind. It's nonsense, an inspector said when the rumor reached Berlin. You can't hide from radar with carpentry. But at the Gotha plant, a young technician with a cigarette tucked behind his ear held a field antenna toward a cured panel and watched the needle on his meter sit lower than it should. He didn't know why. He only knew enough to look around before saying anything, then decided to say nothing at all. By March, Allied maps showed the sky over Thuringia thick with bombers. The Hortons worked not against time, but in spite of it. The V3 took shape, ribs and skin, ducts and ducts inside ducts, a promise assembling itself under lamps that flickered with every distant blast. Raymar penciled calculations and margins, arrowed them, rewrote them darker. Walter visited less. Flying for the Luftwaffe had become less flying and more evasions. In one of the last entries in the shop journal, a hand recorded Ho 9 V3, wing sections cured, nose cone fitted, engine mounts awaiting delivery. Weather, cold. Morale, stubborn. Beneath it, a clumsy stamp, Project 229. They never got to test it. The siren that ended their shift one afternoon didn't signal a raid. It signaled an arrival. Trucks, olive drab, with white stars. The guards had already slipped away. Someone hung a scrap of sheet on a pole for a flag. In the confusion, a tarpaulin went over the wing. Men who had spent 2 years learning how to vanish watched their invention do the same. Weeks later, in a different language, other hands would touch that same surface and feel the strange warmth of resin over wood, the coal's ghost in the pores. In a different notebook, a different officer would write a version of the same sentence the anonymous tester had written. This shouldn't work. It almost does. In the spring light, the black wing waited under dust. And within a few months, American engineers would stand in that hangar doorway, pull the tarp, and realize that the future had been built in the dark and left behind for them to find. Summer, 1945. The war was finished, but the ghosts of it still arrived in crates. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, British engineers unbolted a wooden coffin stamped with fading black crosses. Inside lay something too strange to look defeated. Curved wood, scorched metal, and a cockpit like a blind eye. The label on the side read simply, Horten Ho 229, recovered from Gotha, Germany. They called the project Operation Seahorse. Officially, it was a technical assessment of German aeronautics. Unofficially, it was an autopsy of genius. The hangar smelled of varnish and dust. The aircraft, or what was left of it, sat on trestles under harsh white lamps. Every screw was catalogued, every seam photographed. It wasn't wreckage. It was a riddle in 3 dimensions. Colonel John Sanderson, an American liaison attached to the study, watched the technicians ease a wooden panel from the wing. The piece weighed less than expected. He turned it in his hands, feeling the lightness. It's too light, he muttered, almost to himself. Then, softer, like it's not supposed to be seen. The others laughed, but Sanderson didn't. He'd flown over Europe. He'd seen radar operators swear they could feel ghosts on their screens. Aircraft there 1 second, gone the next. Now, under his fingertips, he suspected he was touching one. They began the dissection. Layers of laminated wood peeled away like the skin of an onion. The construction was crude and delicate at once. Thin birch sheets bonded by a dark resin that left a metallic scent in the air. When one of the chemists scraped it with a scalpel, the edge came up black and glittering. "What's this mixed in?" he asked. The lab team ran the residue under a spectrometer. The reading was odd, traces of carbon, graphite, and coal dust. Not random impurities. A deliberate blend. The room went quiet. "Graphite conducts electricity," said one of the younger scientists. "It could scatter or absorb electromagnetic waves." Sanderson looked up from his notes. "You mean radar?" "Maybe. It wouldn't vanish completely, but it'd fade." Someone snorted. "You think the Germans built a stealth plane out of plywood?" But another voice answered, low and certain, "He didn't build a plane. He built a question mark for radar." In the following days, they found more signs that what looked accidental was actually orchestration. The wing's leading edge was subtly curved, not symmetrical, but tuned to deflect, not reflect. The exhausts were buried deep within the wing, the cockpit shielded by layered plexiglass tinted smoke gray. Even the paint, what little remained, contained ferrite particles. None of this was coincidence. Sanderson wrote in his report, "Design philosophy unknown. Aerodynamics unconventional but deliberate. Materials suggest intent to minimize electromagnetic reflection. Concept far exceeds contemporary British or American understanding." At night, he stayed behind in the hangar, walking slow circles around the carcass of the aircraft. He kept thinking of the men who built it, two brothers sketching in candlelight while their country collapsed around them. Had they known what they were making? Or had desperation simply pushed them to discover something decades ahead of its time? He placed a hand on the curved edge of the wing. Beneath the varnish, the surface was warm, almost alive. "You were trying to hide," he whispered. The next morning, they tested sections of the skin with radio waves. The reflection dropped by more than half compared to standard wood or metal. It wasn't invisible, but it was quiet, like an echo fading down a long hallway. The British technicians began to argue. Some said it was coincidence, the byproduct of wartime shortages, not science. Others were less sure. "If this was luck," said one engineer, "it was the luck of a mathematician." They reconstructed the shape in chalk on the hangar floor, a wingspan so wide it brushed the walls. With the correct jet power and fuel, it could have crossed the channel in under 20 minutes. London to Ash before anyone saw it coming. Sanderson stared at the outline. 20 minutes, he repeated. The words sounded heavy in the empty hangar. Outside, rain streaked down the windows, thin and cold. The war had ended, yet the future it had spawned was only beginning to wake. Later that day, his final log entry read, "Horton Ho 229 represents a theoretical threat beyond existing radar capacity. Not science fiction, only premature science. Recommend transfer to U.S. custody for further evaluation." He didn't sign his name, just his initials, faint and hurried. The crate was resealed 2 days later, bound for a new destination, Wright Field, Ohio. On the lid, someone stenciled a single word in black paint, "Confidential." No one in that hangar spoke of what they'd seen again, but every man there knew the same thing, that this was no accident of desperation. The Black Wing from Germany had not been luck. It had been intent. And when they calculated the potential flight path one last time, the numbers chilled the room. If it had ever flown as planned, it could have reached London in 20 minutes, and no radar on Earth would have seen it coming. 1946. The war was over, but the obsession was not. In a corner of Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers were piecing together something that looked half aircraft, half rumor. Crates marked Ho 229 had arrived from England under escort. The wooden panels were warped from travel, the jet mounts empty, but the silhouette, that impossible black wing, was unmistakable. They called it a reconstruction, but in truth, it was a resurrection. The hangar was quiet except for the whine of drills and the occasional cough of an acetylene torch. Men in blue overalls fitted carbon-stained plywood like surgeons aligning ribs. The shape came together slowly, the same smooth, predatory arc that had haunted Colonel John Sanderson's sketches back in Farnborough. When the technicians finally stepped back, the assembled wing stretched nearly 55 feet across. It looked less like a plane and more like a creature that had evolved for a world without gravity. "Jesus," one of them murmured. "It's beautiful." The Air Force didn't care about beauty. They wanted numbers, signatures, frequencies, the kind of data that could prove whether the rumors were true. So the machine was rolled into a radar test chamber and pointed toward an SCR-584 tracking array, the same radar used during the Normandy landings. The test began at dusk. The operators adjusted dials, the screen humming with green light. The Horton model sat on a turntable, spinning slowly. For a moment, it appeared clear as a heartbeat, a solid blip on the scope. Then, as the wing tilted, the signal began to fade. 10 degrees, 2030. And then it was gone. The screen was empty. The radar was working, but the target had vanished. "We thought the equipment was broken," one technician later recalled. "We ran it 3 times. Same result. Every time the wing turned edge on, it disappeared." Silence filled the chamber. The men exchanged looks that were half disbelief, half unease. It wasn't total invisibility, but it was the first time any aircraft had ever fooled radar at all. The engineers began recalculating, layering data across the flight profiles from captured documents. The shape, the composite materials, the buried engines, all combined to scatter radio waves instead of reflecting them. By morning, Sanderson had written a new line in his report. The Horten 229 demonstrates radar absorption characteristics decades ahead of known aviation technology. A sergeant reading over his shoulder asked, "So what does that mean?" Sanderson stared at the glowing scope, still blank. "It means," he said, "if they'd had 6 more months, our bombers would never have come home." That sentence made its way up the chain of command, across offices where men smoked cigars and talked about post-war opportunities. The files were stamped classified. The aircraft itself was disassembled again, its pieces stored in a hangar where sunlight never reached the floor. Officially, the experiment was closed, but engineers kept copies of the blueprints, sketches folded into notebooks. They studied the way the wing's surface met the air, how its curvature guided not just lift, but invisibility. Some of them would go on to work for Northrop, others for secret Air Force projects that didn't yet have names. When they spoke of what they'd seen, they called it the ghost effect. One young engineer wrote home to his father that year. The Germans were trying to make a plane disappear, and the terrifying thing is, they almost did. In the years that followed, the Horten's legend drifted through laboratories like a rumor that refused to die. Official reports called it a curiosity, but to those who'd watched the radar screens that night, it was a revelation wrapped in wood and smoke. They realized the brothers hadn't merely designed a weapon, they had invented a new way of thinking about flight itself. Not about speed, not about altitude, about absence. The idea that power could come not from being seen, but from never being found. That discovery frightened the Americans more than anything else. Because if 2 brothers working in a collapsing country could build the world's first invisible plane, what might come next when a nation with unlimited resources decided to chase the same ghost? And someone already had. Across the hall from the radar bay, a colonel was on the phone to Washington, saying only one sentence that everyone in the hangar would remember for the rest of their lives. "Tell them, the shape works." The war had ended, but the shadow it cast was still climbing into the sky. By the late 1940s, America was dreaming of wings that looked nothing like the bombers that won the war. No tails, no fuselages, just pure, endless sweep, as if the horizon itself could fly. And buried deep in classified archives at Wright Field were the sketches that had started it all. The Horten design was officially of no immediate value, but its ghost lived on in every engineer who had touched it. In 1947, a California designer named Jack Northrop rolled out an aircraft that looked suspiciously familiar, the YB-49 Flying Wing. Twin-jet engines, blended body, and that same impossible geometry that seemed more creature than machine. When reporters asked where the inspiration came from, Northrop smiled and said, "Nature." But those who'd seen the captured Horten plane knew better. Flight tests over the Mojave Desert drew crowds of officers and dreamers. The YB-49 sliced through the air like a whisper, its silhouette nearly identical to the black wing found in Germany. Yet, as if cursed by its origin, the aircraft was unstable, unpredictable, ahead of its time. One crash during testing killed its entire crew. The project was quietly shelved. But the idea, invisibility through shape, refused to die. Through the 1950s and 60s, as the Cold War turned skies into chessboards, the United States began studying radar in ways no one had imagined during World War II. Engineers revisited old classified notes from Operation Seahorse. They recalculated angles, revisited curvature equations, tested new materials. The words Horten 229 appeared in footnotes that no one outside the Pentagon ever read. One 1949 memo, declassified decades later, stated, HO 229 demonstrated minimal radar reflection. Principle worth future study. In the strange symmetry of history, the weapon designed for a defeated regime became the seed of a new empire's defense. As one Air Force scientist put it years later, we took the darkness and used it for protection. By the 1980s, that darkness had taken form again. The Two-Spirit emerged from hangars in Missouri, a matte-black flying wing that seemed to drink light instead of reflect it. Its surface was seamless, its engine noise a whisper, its radar signature no larger than a bird's. To most of the world, it was the pinnacle of American innovation. To those who remembered the Horton brothers, it was déjà vu. When the B-2 made its first public flight in 1997, aviation historians gathered like witnesses at a resurrection. One of them, a frail German man with white hair and trembling hands, watched in silence. His name was Raymar Horton. The dream he and his brother had drawn in the ashes of a dying nation had returned, reborn under another flag. Asked what he felt seeing it, he said softly, "It flies exactly as we imagined. Only now, the sky belongs to someone else." He died a few years later, leaving behind notebooks filled with sketches of wings that might have come from the future. In the Smithsonian archives today, one can still find a faded photograph from 1945, the Americans standing over the strange wooden craft in a ruined hangar. Beside it, penciled in a margin by an unknown hand, are 4 words: the future, unfinished work. History, it seems, had finished it for them. The irony is hard to ignore. The first stealth aircraft, the shape that defined modern warfare, was conceived not in a superpower's laboratory, but in a starving nation's workshop, by 2 brothers who wanted to make a plane that could survive a world gone mad. They never saw it used. They never saw how their idea became both shield and sword. The Black Wing of Germany became the silent guardian of America. And maybe that is the cruel truth of progress, that invention doesn't choose sides. It simply waits for someone to understand it. Because sometimes the future isn't discovered. It's found, under a tarp, in a hangar, built by the enemy. And once the shadow of it takes flight, it never lands again.